All right, good afternoon, all those present and online. I'd like to introduce Mr. Keon Cheong. Is that correct? Have I read the name correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, Keon Cheong, who is coordinator of regional special education, regional and special education needs, in Disability and Diagnostic Treatment Center in Guyana. He is skilled in nonprofit organizations, educational consulting, lecturing, interventions, and lesson planning. He's an experienced education officer with a demonstrated history of working in the education industry. He is an education professional with a certificate focused on special education from leadership education in neurodevelopmental and related disabilities. And third, he has a great presentation for us today. So, Mr. Cheong.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon again. My name is Keon Cheong, and I am the coordinator for the Regional Special Education Needs Diagnostic and Treatment Center. The regional center basically came as a result of a CARICOM Heads of Government Summit, whereby the government of Cuba would have put forward a number of initiatives to strengthen the program of cooperation between itself, Cuba, and the rest of the Caribbean region, more so those in CARICOM. Guyana would have inherited two such projects. One would have been the project to revive the fisheries industry, while the other one would have been to establish a center for stimulating children, youth, and adolescents with special education needs associated with disabilities. It is against that backdrop that the purpose of the center is basically to provide the region, the CARICOM region, with a unified position as it relates to identifying, treating, and preventing disabilities in Guyana. This basically is what the background, basically an overview of the background here. Where the concept of the center is anchored, it's anchored in the Salamanca Declaration, basically, which would be the Human Rights Declaration, which basically speaks about the rights of persons in accessing different services and being treated fairly and the quality of life. It's also anchored in the Petionville Declaration. This is whereby the CARICOM Heads of Government in Cuba in 2013 would have signed an agreement reaffirming their commitment to ensuring and supporting the improved quality of life of persons with disabilities in the region. It is also anchored in the laws of Guyana, 3605 and 3901. 3605 is the Disability Act, the 2010 Disability Act, and 3901 specifically speaks to the laws of Guyana as it relates to education, whereby we're saying that everyone must receive an education. And basically you cannot exclude or discriminate a person on the grounds of them having a disability from accessing education. In Guyana, we acknowledge the 13 categories of disabilities as listed by the Individual with Disability Education Act, IDEA. And those are the 13 categories there: autism, deaf-blind, deafness and hearing impairment, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, multiple disability, orthopedic impairment, specific learning disability, visual impairment, blindness, and traumatic brain injury. The composition of the center. Because the center is poised on providing an interdisciplinary approach dealing with persons with disabilities, and to provide a region, all the other CARICOM member states, with how disability can be dealt with, the center here in Guyana is staffed with a combination it allowed for a partnership and a marriage between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health to be forged. And so we have speech therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, psychologists, psychopedagogists, social workers, special education teacher, professional, individual education planner or transition officer, and an applied behavior analysis therapist. These are the persons that come together to give each individual that comprehensive approach assessment. Who accesses the services of the center? Persons coming from the center they come from We basically deal with children, youth, and adolescents, newborns as well. And they come from the very top circle there, health centers and clinics. Here we have persons from both the health centers and the clinics referring children, youth, and adolescents to the regional center. They come from the hospital, example, the developmental clinics or the neurology clinic, they would refer individuals to the regional center. And they come from schools and society, all coming there to the regional center. They come to the regional center to access and to basically help them in terms of early identification and intervention. We provide stimulating, particularly for the young ones, stimulation helping them to understand what it is that they can do to support the learning of their individual. Providing education evaluations. These would be psychoeducation evaluations, more so done by the psychologist. And coming out of the psychoeducation evaluations would be the individual education plan within which you would find the transition plan. The transition plan takes into effect or is kick-started once the individual would have reached the age of 14. Then we look for a pre-vocational skill or trade that we can align this individual with, helping them to go forward and to live and lead a better life or improve their quality of life too. The process of the center begins with an interview. The interview is in-depth. It's about 150 questions. So the timing goes somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour based on the amount of information that the person has to present. When the interview is finished, then we have something we call a set of tests, whereby the social worker will deliver to all those specialists that I was showing you earlier what the information is. And each specialist will be listening to the information against the backdrop of their area of speciality. So for instance, the psychologist would be listening against the backdrop of what specific educational instrument I can use with this particular individual. For instance, if the individual is coming from Georgetown, then I know I perhaps can use the WISC. As opposed to if the individual is coming from deep south in the Pomeroon, I may use the UNIT. The UNIT is basically Universal Nonverbal Intelligence Test. And I'm going to use that one because English may not be the first language of this individual, and such, to make the test as valid and as reliable as possible, yielding the most accurate results, we would use the UNIT as opposed to using the WISC. Once that instrument has been chosen, then the individual will come into the center to access the services. They will come no less than 2 times, but they can come as many times as needed. This would be based on the fact that if the individual becomes saturated or tired during the assessment, it is discontinued, and then the individual has the opportunity of coming again to be assessed based on the different instruments. The UNIT, the WISC, the WIAT all have subtests. For instance, the WIAT is one that you'd be looking for, you'd use particularly looking for a specific learning disability. And the WIAT has 20 subtests within it. So while little Keon may come in because he's showing some challenges with reading or some other challenge, we may find when we're doing the actual assessment that that's not really challenging. So we need to choose from among the other subtests to really be able to narrow in to see exactly what the challenge is with Keon. So the individual may need to come back 2, 3, 4 times. Once the diagnostic process is finished, whereby the individual will have seen all the different specialists and departments I would have mentioned earlier, then we have what we call the elaboration. Because it's a psychoeducational process, the psychology department will lead in this particular area here, in the sense that they will basically, for the purpose of education, identify what exactly the challenge is. If it is the individual is suspected of having autism, while we would have done the evaluation, we would have noticed that the individual has autism, but also shows some other traits, which may be that of an intellectual impairment. The psychoeducation evaluation would be the one to basically say, while the individual shows or can be eligible for a dual diagnosis, which condition is the one that really affects the learning of this individual? And if it is intellectual disability, then the individual is placed in a classroom and receives instruction along the lines of intellectual disability, because that is the one that's hindering the academic progress. So that is what the elaboration there is about. The other one, from the elaboration, we would move into the IEP. Based on the age of the individual, this is where we would basically If the individual is below 14 years old, an individual education plan is drafted in collaboration with the parents, the class teacher, the school supervisor, or the regional officer. All those persons are included because it is important to ensure that the services that we're talking about, that little Keon can access, are readily available, because the individual education plan has a timeline, a lifespan, so to speak. More or most, if not all, individual education plans will have a lifespan of 1 year, 1 academic year. So it would run from September to June of the following year. And within that time, those goals are expected to be achieved. So if we're going to say little Keon is going to need assistive devices, while the parent can say it, so the teacher can say it. So if the school doesn't have the assistive devices, if the region doesn't have the resources to procure the assistive device, then Keon would not achieve his objective at the end of the academic year. So that is why we bring all those persons to sit there to really talk about how this can work. It is also important that we have all those persons together, because what we've been finding of recent is that some of the children are struggling in school, not because of that they have an innate challenge, but because the parent or the environment presents challenges that are of concern to them. In some instances, we would have found that a little kiddo is sitting there at nights, keeping watch of his mother while she sleeps. He's doing that because mommy would have had 2 attempts at suicide. This here is impacting for him because he's sitting there watching mommy sleep just so that mommy doesn't attempt to do that, but then it takes away from his sleep. So when he goes into the classroom, he's naturally tired and he can't focus nor function. He can't focus nor function. That affects his academic performance. His academic performance is affected. It affects his overall performance in matriculating through the system. So that is where the entire thing comes under. In addition to that, if Keon were to achieve the age of 14, we would engage one of the technical institutes based on Keon's level of functioning. If he has an intellectual disability that's mildly affected, we would look to see, okay, what skill can he learn? What skill can we impart with him? How can we align him or do some job coaching for him as it relates to that there? So that is basically how the center operates, just to give you an idea. The remainder of the presentation would basically be, I don't know if I pause here for questions or we do the questions at the end of it. Does anyone have any questions as it relates to this part here so far?
Does anyone have any questions? If you are,
sorry, I didn't get that. Hello?
Yes. I was asking if anyone had any questions.
Oh, okay.
Do not at this point, so please continue.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is here basically is a comparison. In 2020, we would have seen, the center that is, would have seen, and when I say by seen, I mean interviewed and assessed a total of 56 persons for all of 2020. In 2021, the first half of 2021, we would have interviewed 156 individuals. Of the 156 individuals that would have been interviewed in 2021, 59 of them would have received an eligibility already. So it shows that compared to 2020, we would have surpassed that number by 100% or more than 100% there. This can be as a result of the heightened awareness that we have been doing at the Ministry of Education and at the Ministry of Health. I know that the rehab services, Dr. Mangarj, the head of that, has been instrumental in helping us to promote the work that we do and the occurrence of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the occurrence of COVID-19 pandemic, what we found more parents understanding and being part of the reality is that while their kiddos are at home with them and they're engaging in online learning and the other kinds of receiving worksheets, the kiddos are not really functioning. They're not able to really understand the content. And this here has awakened or heightened the reality in the parents that, you know, hey, something is wrong. So this representation here basically highlights the male to female representation of persons who would have entered the center by now and who would have received an eligibility. This ratio shows more males than females would have access to eligibility. And this here aligns with all the literature speaks about. Literature basically says that more males than females are in special ed. And this here is what we see right here in Guyana as well. The regional center is in a position because it is serving the region, and even wider than the region, as you can see there, we have persons coming from Guyana, Venezuela, Jamaica, Bahamas, Canada, and the US. Some of them are coming for new evaluations, and some of them are coming because they're now living in Guyana, they're having they're being re-evaluated to see exactly how far along they've come in terms of their meeting their goals and their milestones based on the individual education plan that they would have had. This here is within Guyana, the regional reach for Guyana. So far, we have been working in regions 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Georgetown there. And we basically be providing regional services to these places whereby the interdisciplinary team serves them. We would have collaborated with the pediatricians, the regional health officers, the physiotherapists, the speech therapists, and the occupational therapists, and the rehab assistants in these regions to provide services to these individuals. This is one of the reasons why we can also say we have that huge number in 2021 as opposed to what we saw in 2020. Racial composition. We have persons coming more so from the Afro-Guyanese background or Afros, East Indians, and then we have the mixed group there. We can see that the Afro or Negroes are leading in that area there. Age ranges. Based on this diagram here, we see that the 6 to 10 age range is the largest group seen at the center. And these here in Guyana would be our primary aged students. So we can say that more primary age students are accessing the services.
Yes.
You able to see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just think I have one more after this one here. So yes, basically I was saying that this here is our age ranges for the individuals who access the services of the center. And the last slide I have here is the prevalence of disability. Based on the number of persons we would have assessed in the first half of 2021, the highest number or the disability with the highest numbers would be that of intellectual disability. Now, what this translates into is that more persons, or the number of children with intellectual disability sitting within the mainstream classrooms, which is alarming. What it also says is that persons were being, if you look there, the yellow, you see 20%, and that accounts for normal intelligence. And it says there too that persons who have normal intelligence are referred to the center to be assessed. And normal intelligence in the sense that academically they're fine. But when the correlation between them being or having a normal intelligence and being referred to the center and the whole emotional challenge, because these individuals, the challenge basically is just that they have a behavioral issue. And because they have a behavioral issue, they're sent to the center to be evaluated. What we found is that they do not have a learning disability or an intellectual disability, but they can function very well in the mainstream classroom. That was the last of my slides. I know this was a bit of a rush. Are there any questions? Is there anything anyone would like me to go over? Did I go too fast there for anyone?
Someone have a question? Once they're identified as having a disability, so what follows after that diagnosis of having a disability? Do they get some special consideration in school?
Oh, thank you very much. Once the individual has a disability, we would draft then we call the IEP meeting together. And we would say to the parents, okay, little Keon has a disability and this is what little Keon has. Based on what he has and based on the level of effect, we recommend that little Keon goes to a special school. While we may say that once the evaluation has been done, it's not the end of the process. And what will happen is that every year, the individual would come back to the center to have his or her goals reevaluated. When Keon reaches the age of 14, then we do a transition plan for him. The transition plan is basically, we're looking to see which vocational institute we can link Keon with to better achieve his goals.
Afternoon, can I ask a question, please, for Mr. Cheong? I've noted
Certainly.
your pie distribution on disability, but I think I missed the actual number of these persons that you assess in. This is assessed in your facility, isn't it?
That is correct.
So how many persons is it in total?
Well, for 2020, where we would have interviewed 156 for the first half, we would have only assessed about 59 of them so far. And this would be as a result of those coming from the mainstream schools and the special schools in Guyana.
And all years and all, sorry, I missed that part, right? This is what ages again?
Oh, the ages of, one moment, let me just see if I can, I've been disabled as a host, but we have the 0 to 5 age ranges, the 6 to 11, 11 to 15, and the 23 plus. The majority of those individuals would come between the 6 to 10 age range.
Okay, and once you assess them, then you can actually give the diagnosis. I noticed that you said more on learning disabilities. This is all coming from the school system, isn't it? Or are you open for outsiders?
No, they're out. They're coming from private institutions as well, walk-ins, and they're coming from other countries. For those, like we have migrants or migrants now, we also have those that we attend to.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right.